In this video, I'm going to discuss why I don't watch the news, why you probably shouldn't either, some of the problems with not watching the news, and some ways to address those problems. So why don't I watch the news? By news, I'm mainly referring to television video. I used to watch the news when I was younger, religiously. My family did. This is quite a while ago, back in the 70s and 80s into the early 90s, when I kind of gave up for the most part on watching the news. In those days were different in that the news was basically, there were four sources for the news. There was ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, the public broadcast system. And everywhere you went, most stations, including nearly all the VHFs, the easier to receive stations, were affiliated with ABC, NBC, or CBS, and there would usually be one PBS station in the area you were in. There was one in Los Angeles when I lived in that area. There was one in Connecticut when I lived there. There was one PBS station in the Champaign-Urbana area when I was a grad student there. The news came on. What I remember is 6:30 we would watch NBC, and then at 7 we would pick either CBS or ABC, and the news was very, very similar on all four channels. PBS had a slightly more intellectual, maybe slightly more liberal feel to it, but they were all very, very similar. They covered the same stories, the same issues, even sometimes the same trivia. And there were shows on Sundays, which I think may still exist, like Face the Nation, Issues and Answers. They weren't like they are today. There was very little overt opinion in the news. It was supposedly factual reporting and a dry, unbiased sounding delivery. Now, the right wing, the Republicans, conservatives, would claim it was liberal media and biased against them. There might have been some truth in that. None of this was like what's happened the last 5 or 6 years, where we've developed extremely partisan, loud, yelling, opinionated MSNBC, CNN versus Fox. You didn't see that at all. It was very dry and seemingly more credible than what we have today. Even if you didn't agree with the, quote, liberal bias or whatever the bias seemed to be, you often took it as mostly factual, as this is what's going on in the world, and you have to make up your own opinion. Was that really true? Well, there's a couple of things that led me to eventually stop watching the news. One was very practical. It just didn't relate, I found, to everyday life. I had been watching it as a kid, a student, a college student, a grad student, things like that. But it actually provided very, very little information relevant to your job, to making a living, to dealing with a lot of everyday issues. So it was anywhere from a half hour to an hour a day spent on things that, as a practical matter, rarely impacted you. But there were some other issues. One is that I found cases where my personal experience clearly showed, and followed by research, usually when you find your experience doesn't agree with the news, you should look into it and try to understand why it doesn't. So an example of that, and I should add that the promotion of the idea that there's a terrible shortage of scientists, Ph.D.s, is something that goes far beyond the television news. In fact, they only mention it occasionally. It also turns up heavily in print media that I was reading at the time, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other sources. It's very ubiquitous, these claims that there are shortages of scientists, specifically. And it overlaps with programmers today. But historically, there's a claim of a shortage, a desperate shortage of scientists, and particularly actually physicists, which I was in. I didn't really was that aware of this when I was younger, but I think it impacted my parents, for example, and the advice that adults, teachers, and parents would give you as far as what to do with your life or whether to get a Ph.D. or things like that, which directly affected me because I went and got a Ph.D. in physics, which was probably a bad decision. But it was based indirectly on this kind of media coverage, which created a false impression. These claims that there are shortages of scientists go back to at least the 1940s, and there's examples of them during the Depression, okay, massive unemployment, but there's still examples of them. These were heavily promoted about physics in particular in the 1950s and 60s, especially after Sputnik. They were false then, and they are way false now and have been for years. And it's actually, once you get into the field, you realize, no, there's an oversupply of people. About half the people who get PhDs in most fields, like physics, leave and don't pursue a further career. Part of the reason for that is there aren't actually that many jobs even at the postdoc level, which is the next step for most people. Also, there are way more postdocs than there are actual long-term jobs. And all this became very clear. And if I had been paying close attention when I was an undergraduate at Caltech, if I'd ignored the fluff and looked closely at numbers and so forth, I would have found that this was the case, and I probably would not have pursued a PhD. Particularly understanding that the scientific community, meaning government programs that fund science, so-called, that they are consistently falsely claiming this, which means they're either grossly dishonest people or they're crazy, incompetent, and delusional, or both. So this is a specific example with the news completely disagreeing with what I found to be reality, a direct personal experience. There are also cases where I researched a big news story, and I didn't have personal experience with it. And I'm going to get to this issue that you can't verify most of what you see in the news from your personal direct experience. That's one of the main reasons to be cautious with it, and in my opinion, not just not watch it at all. So I would research various issues and find things that didn't add up or were highly contradictory, and which, in fact, are not discussed by anybody on the supposed spectrum of mainstream, what we would call mainstream media today. That obviously led to, real doubts about the wisdom of relying on the news. Now let me get to maybe the most significant thing. Television news and video news is very short. It's very simple. It often doesn't give references. We see more of that today with the internet and YouTube and other video platforms. But it's very difficult even to do the research and verify what you can. But most importantly, what is covered in the news, or certainly when I watched it a lot, are things that are very difficult to verify. An awful lot of the coverage, if you actually back up and think about it, is conflicts, violent conflicts in third world countries. So El Salvador in the 80s, Yugoslavia in the 90s, Syria right now, Iraq. They're countries mostly don't speak English, where there's serious problems going on, or at least being reported in the news. I mean, you'll be seeing people killing each other with machine guns, bombing each other. You're not going to go there and find out what's really going on in that country or that situation, right? It's not France, it's not England or Japan where some people can go. Very, very few people have any direct experience. And even if you were one of that small number of Americans that used to go to El Salvador in the 70s for, summer vacation or something like that before it blew up, which was a tiny number of people, how much do you know about what's going on there if you're only there for a few weeks or a month or two? So an awful lot. This is an awful lot of your news. Now it's passionate. It's always linked in some way to our national security. Sometimes that's done by pointing to resources, oil in the Middle East, or when Angola or Mozambique and South Africa were in the news in the 70s and 80s, it would be chromium or cobalt or gold or uranium or so. So there's something is done to link it to our national security. In the Cold War, it would almost always be linked to the Cold War, to Russia, even if it's some tiny little country that has virtually nothing, like El Salvador. It's basically a country that produced coffee, cotton, and sugar. They were the fourth largest coffee exporter in the world. They had no significant mineral resources. They had almost no manufacturing. There was a Texas Instruments chip factory in San Salvador. They probably employed, a few thousand people at most in a country of 4 million people. Just tiny relevance to the U.S., some of these places where the conflicts occur. But they're always linked to our national security. The Cold War, and then later the War on Terror, and now we seem to be seeing things like climate change and COVID pandemic, emerging diseases as the pretext why we should be concerned about, whether people are vaccinated or not in South Africa, for example, with the Omicron variant and the dubious news coverage of what's going on right now. So the point is, you can't really verify a lot of this stuff, whatever you may believe, and whatever you might think is going on. Now, there are other topics that are very common in the news: sensational crimes, serial killers, celebrity murders, and that sort of thing. They're usually, again, they're people you know nothing about. It's in some, for most of us, in some city far away. It's very hard to find out what was going on. Some of these have political overtones, like the Atlanta child/youth murders in 1980 when I was a kid. Okay, this was a series of murders of kids and some, youths, people in their 20s actually, in Atlanta that were blamed on a single serial killer eventually, Wayne Williams. But initially, during the 1980 presidential campaign, this was strongly implied in the news coverage to be some kind of racist thing, the Ku Klux Klan, all this kind of stuff. It all disappeared instantly after President Reagan took over. And then within a month or two, they had arrested Wayne Williams, and it was a gay serial killer, supposedly. How do you verify any of this? And in fact, if you look into some of these cases of these sensational crimes, questions arise. There's quite a number of questions about Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders. I don't claim to know what happened there or understand it, but that's the issue. You get these short sound bites on the television news, usually about things you know nothing about. They're not happening in your neighborhood. They're often sensational, man bites dog kind of stories. An awful lot of what you see on the news you cannot verify. And in cases where I could verify it, it often wasn't true. Or there were really serious questions. If you drilled down and you really tried to research in detail, you went to other sources, to books, to things that in many cases, most significantly, were not funded by advertising. You'll often see a different picture. Secondly, the news in those days, all of this is licensed airtime or licensed airwaves from the federal government, the Federal Communications Commission. There's all sorts of regulation. And that probably leads to pressure for certain perspectives to be presented. Something that I remember, this is not the news, but it's an interesting point. In the late 70s, there were two highly political shows that appeared on the major networks. One was called Lou Grant, where Ed Asner, who's quite left-wing actor, plays Lou Grant, originally from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He's a editor or publisher, he's the editor for a fictional Los Angeles area newspaper. And it was basically the liberal cause of the week. And that was on, I forget if it was ABC or NBC, but the other show was Quincy, which was a medical examiner played by Jack Klugman, which started out as a murder mystery show, and it evolved fairly quickly into the liberal political cause of the week. And they would have somebody dies and they're brought to the pathology office, and Quincy autopsies them, and it turns out to be some social cause, autistic kids or, all kinds of things like this. And these were very political shows, and they were very popular, partly because they were at prime time. They were put on, I think Quincy was Friday at 9 or something like that in the evening, and Lou Grant, I think, was Mondays at 8 or 9 in the evening for a long time. Well, what happened when the liberal Democrat Jimmy Carter got voted out and Reagan came in? These shows they disappeared really quickly. They were canceled. There are other things like that. You could see that, the political winds seem to have some significant influence on things you would see on broadcast TV and the news coverage. But again, the major point I want to make is you can't verify this stuff, and it often doesn't add up as you start to drill down into it. I can't do it. I'm, keeping this to be short, so I'm not going to go into all of that in detail in this one video. But it's better not to watch the news and get influenced by these very superficial stories that you can't verify and that often have little to do with your everyday life or even not so everyday life. It's better to get your information from other sources. I would argue to try to identify sources that are not being funded by advertising or some kind of public relations money or things like that. That's a lot easier said than done because, of course, public relations groups understand that people are wary of advertising-supported media, so the value of influencers or sources that appear independent of the advertising should be clear to most of us. It isn't always, but most of us should be. There is a problem with not watching the news because you're sometimes not up on what other people are concerned about. That can be good. You're not freaking out over some issue that's really very minor. Also, kind of alternative media, which we have a lot of today on the internet, tends to echo the news. It just gives you a different perspective, or what's purported to be a different perspective. If the mainstream news is hyping Syria or the Afghan withdrawal or something like that, you'll find a lot of the alternative stuff echoes it, even if they have some different perspective. And in many cases, you can predict pretty clearly what they're going to say, kind of independent of what might or might not be going on in actual reality. They sort of start out from their opinion or ideological tribe and work backwards. That's obviously, not so great, right? That doesn't really tell you what's going on. So the problem becomes, what do you do for alternatives to think about it? And I can't give a complete answer to that. I would say, again, try to avoid things that are clearly funded by advertising. Try to find other sources, and also look closely at your own experience. Does it match up in any way? Can you actually verify directly the things that are being claimed? I suspect, as I did with the purported job market for scientists, you'll find that a significant amount of the time your personal experience, or failing that, the personal experience of people actually involved in the story, may differ substantially from what the news is promoting, what it's claiming. I'm going to conclude by saying a lot of the news you cannot verify from your personal experience and is not particularly relevant to you, but it can still influence you and can lead you to believe other things which actually your experience contradicts, right? You think you can trust these people because of the emotional appeal of these short, simplistic stories, and they are stories. They're designed to tell you some narrative in many cases, and that's even worse today, I would say, than it was back 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Don't watch the news. Our Censored Search website and service enables you to search censored and shadow banned websites for suppressed information. We offer transparency on what the search ranking algorithms are doing and tools to help you separate fact from disinformation. We offer both a free service for everyone and a paid professional service with full access to our tools and the ability to customize the search algorithms for your needs. Our business model is end-user funded to avoid either direct control or subconscious bias from advertisers. Our censored search service is intended as a complement to increasingly censored, advertising-funded search engines, such as Google, Yahoo, Bing, and even DuckDuckGo, which appears to be increasingly shadow banning alternative content. We cannot duplicate many useful features of the advertising-funded search engines yet, nor is this needed. Use our search engine for censored and shadow-banned content. Get the other side or sides of the story. Remember, there are often more than two sides to a story. Inclusion in our search engine is not an endorsement. We include sites based on evidence of censorship or shadow banning in our judgment. We attempt to be neutral and provide tools to our users to evaluate and verify the content without relying on our fallible judgment. There is evidence that powerful interests actively spread disinformation to alternative sites to make identifying suppressed factual information difficult and discredit factual information through guilt by association. We are developing tools to fight these active disinformation tactics. Give us a try at censored-search.com, censored-search.net, or censored-search.org. We welcome constructive feedback. How can we serve you better? Bookmark our site as the censorship is growing by leaps and bounds. You may need us more in the future. Let your friends and colleagues know.
You can access more advanced features and support development of a transparent, verifiable search engine that works for you and not giant advertisers such as Big Pharma by becoming a paid subscriber. If you want to support our development work, subscribe now. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.